Please, sir, could I have your leftovers? Those words sliced through the air like a knife. The grand dining hall, usually filled only with the quiet clinking of silverware and the low hum of chandeliers, fell into an eerie silence. Every servant froze mid-step, their trays trembling ever so slightly. Even the flicker of the candles seemed to pause, as though the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. At the wide double door stood a girl, fragile, trembling, and out of place in a mansion that reeked of wealth. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her skin was smooth but pale from hunger. Her hair was messy, and her dress, if it could even be called that, was little more than tattered fabric, faded from sun and rain. On her feet clung a pair of shoes, so worn they looked ready to crumble with every step. But it wasn't her clothes that broke hearts that night. It was her eyes. Those wide, glassy, desperate eyes spoke louder than her timid voice ever could. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much pain for such a young age. They told the story of empty nights, of stomachs growling in the dark, of a little girl forced to carry a burden no child should ever bear. Inside the dining hall, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, was Mr. Raymond Blake, a man who once commanded skyscrapers and empires, now confined to a polished black wheelchair. His hair was silver, his jaw sharp, his suit perfectly pressed. Every inch of him screamed power, and yet emptiness. Years ago, a tragic car accident had stolen the use of his legs, and with it, his joy. Though he had wealth beyond measure, his mansion felt more like a prison than a palace. He had no family left, no laughter echoing through his halls, only silence, bitterness, and a constant reminder of what he had lost. And so, when this frail little girl appeared at his door, her request shook the household to its core. The servants gasped audibly, exchanging nervous glances. No one dared to approach Mr. Blake uninvited, much less to ask him for food. To them, he wasn't just an employer. He was a figure to be feared. Cold, unforgiving, unreachable. Raymond's piercing gray eyes narrowed as he studied the girl. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smirk. Leftovers. His voice was low but sharp, the kind that made people instinctively sit straighter. Little girl, do you even know who I am? I don't trade in crumbs. His words hung heavy, carrying with them years of arrogance and pain. To him, the request sounded almost insulting. Him, the Raymond Blake, being asked for scraps like a common beggar? The girl swallowed hard, her small hands gripping the edge of the doorway as though holding herself up. For a moment, it seemed she might run away, that she might crumble under his glare. But then, something in her shifted. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet strong enough to shake the room. "Not crumbs, sir," she said softly. "A trade. Your leftovers for a miracle." The room seemed to freeze again. Every servant's eyes darted toward Mr. Blake, wondering what his reaction would be. Some felt pity for the girl, others fear for her boldness. But all of them leaned in, waiting. Raymond's smirk faltered just a little. For years, people had begged him for money, favors, jobs, but no one had ever dared use the word miracle. That word had long since been erased from his life. To him, miracles belonged to fairy tales, to stories he no longer believed in. And yet, here was this tiny, trembling girl, standing in his golden cage of a mansion, daring to speak of them. For the first time in years, Raymond Blake wasn't sure whether to laugh or to listen. The moment those brave little words left her lips, "Your leftovers for a miracle." Mr. Raymond Blake's face twisted, and then he did something that made the servants shiver. He threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't the warm, hearty laugh of a man enjoying a good joke. No, it was sharp, bitter, hollow, a laugh that sounded like thunder rolling through an empty valley, rattling against walls too used to silence. "A miracle?" he barked, the corners of his mouth curling cruelly. "Do you think I believe in fairy tales, girl? Miracles don't exist. Money buys everything. Everything. And even money couldn't buy me my legs back." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The servants lowered their eyes, knowing they had heard a piece of truth buried beneath his bitterness. For years, Raymond had carried the wound of his accident, not just in his body, but in his spirit. Once he had been untouchable, striding across cities he owned, feared and admired in equal measure. Now, every day, he sat trapped in a chair that reminded him of what he had lost. His wealth was vast, yet powerless. His empire stood tall, yet he was confined. His heart beat steadily, yet felt empty, and now this frail child dared to stand before him, talking about miracles. But the girl didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her tiny, worn shoes tapping against the marble floor. Her voice, though soft, carried with it a weight that silenced the storm in his laughter. "Sir," she said gently, her eyes locked with his, "I can't promise you riches. I can't promise your legs. But I know something money can't buy." Her innocence pierced through the walls of arrogance he had built around himself. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. But pride rushed back, hard and fast, masking the flicker of curiosity inside him. He scoffed and waved a dismissive hand, as though shooing away an insect. "Fine," he said, mocking her with every word. "Sit, eat. Let's see this so-called miracle of yours. Entertain me." Gasps rippled among the servants. Never, not once, had Mr. Blake invited anyone poor, let alone a ragged child, to sit at his grand dining table. They hesitated, unsure if this was a trick or a genuine command. But Raymond's sharp eyes narrowed. "Well, what are you waiting for? Feed the child." Reluctantly, the head servant stepped forward. His hand shook slightly as he set down a plate in front of the girl, a plate filled with untouched leftovers from Mr. Blake's feast. Golden roasted chicken, fluffy mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables glistening with butter. To the servants, it was just food that would have been discarded. But to the girl, it was a banquet. She looked at it as though it were a treasure. Before lifting her fork, she bowed her head. Her lips moved silently, whispering words so soft that no one but she could hear. A prayer. It was a simple act, but in that mansion, one that hadn't known a prayer in years, it felt like a spark in the dark. Mr. Blake frowned, rolling his eyes. To him, prayer was weakness. He hadn't prayed since the night of his accident, when he begged God for his legs back. When the answer was silence, he closed that door forever. Yet here she was, a child, a beggar, thanking heaven for food that wasn't even meant for her. She took the first bite, and her entire face softened. It was as though warmth itself entered her body. Bite after bite, she ate with quiet reverence, savoring every morsel, every crumb, as though it were the most precious gift she had ever received. The servants watched with softened eyes, guilt and pity flickering within them. Some of them had seen her before, wandering near the gates of the mansion, scavenging from the bins, never daring to knock. To see her here, seated in a chair too big for her, eating at the same table as their master, was almost too much for them to bear. Raymond, however, leaned back in his chair, trying to mask the strange feeling stirring in his chest. He wanted to laugh again, to mock her childish faith. But something about the way she ate, the way she prayed, tugged at a part of him he thought long dead. It had been years since anyone had prayed under his roof. Years since gratitude, not greed, had filled these walls. Years since someone had reminded him that joy wasn't bought. It was felt. A tiny crack formed in the stone around his heart. He clenched his jaw, unwilling to let it show. But deep down, though he would never admit it, not yet, Raymond Blake, the man who believed in nothing but money, had just witnessed the first flicker of something he thought was gone forever. When the last bite was gone, the little girl carefully set down her fork. She didn't gobble like a thief or shove food into her pockets, the way many might expect from someone so hungry. Instead, she sat tall in her chair, though her tiny frame was almost swallowed by its size, and wiped her mouth with the edge of her sleeve. Then she lifted her gaze, straight into the eyes of the man who ruled the mansion. "My name is Naomi," she said softly, but with surprising strength for her age. Her voice echoed gently in the silence, and every servant paused, struck by the calmness in her tone. "My mom says, when you give from your abundance, blessings come back in ways you can't see. That's the miracle I'm offering you, sir. If you let me take the food you don't need, I'll make sure it blesses others too. That's how the miracle works." The words fell like drops of water on stone, quiet but steady, each one creating ripples. Raymond Blake stared at her, his brows knitting together. He leaned back in his wheelchair, his fingers tapping on the armrest, searching for something cruel or witty to cut her words apart. And then he scoffed, a bitter, sharp sound that made some servants flinch. Blessings. His voice carried a sting of sarcasm. Child, look at me. Do you see blessings here? I lost my family. My so-called friends disappeared the moment the parties ended, and I've been stuck in this chair for 10 long years. Do you honestly think sharing food with you is going to fix all that? His words were like iron bars clanging shut, as if he'd seal away the very possibility of hope. But Naomi didn't back down. She leaned forward, her little hands resting on the edge of the table. Her eyes, full of innocence yet burning with quiet strength, met his without wavering. Her voice was so gentle, it was almost a whisper, but it carried farther than a shout. Maybe not fix, she said, but maybe heal. The room stilled. Those 3 words pierced deeper than she could possibly know. For a moment, Raymond wasn't in his grand dining hall. He was somewhere else, sitting on a blanket at a park with his wife, who had once laid her hand on his and whispered similar words when he was angry about business. You don't need to fix everything, Raymond. Sometimes love is enough to heal. The memory cut him like glass. His late wife, gone for years now, had been the only person who truly softened his hard edges. She had believed in kindness, in giving, in charity. She had organized dinners for the poor during holidays, always reminding him, what we have is never just ours. It's meant to be shared. But that was long ago, after her passing, and after the accident that took his legs. Bitterness had drowned every trace of her voice. He buried himself in walls of wealth, shutting out the very values she had lived by. And now, here was Naomi, a little girl who had nothing, sitting at his table and echoing the very words his wife once spoke. Raymond's throat tightened, though he quickly forced the feeling down. He couldn't afford to show weakness. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff. Fine, he said at last, each word dragged out like a reluctant concession. You may take the leftovers each night, but don't call it a miracle. It's just waste management. The servants glanced at each other, stunned. This was not the Raymond Blake they knew. Their master never gave anything freely. If he did, he disguised it with business terms, transactions, deals. And here he was again, trying to turn generosity into something sterile and logical. But Naomi only smiled, a small, radiant smile that seemed to light her whole face. Thank you, sir, she said simply. Her gratitude wasn't laced with sarcasm or calculation. It was pure, honest, overflowing. Something stirred in Raymond's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was uncomfortable, almost irritating, yet strangely warm. He quickly looked away, wheeling himself back from the table, as though putting distance between himself and the strange feeling she carried. Naomi slid off the chair, clutching the bundle of leftovers the servants had wrapped for her. She hugged it to her chest like it was treasure, then gave a little nod of respect before turning toward the door. The servants' eyes followed her silently, some filled with pity, others with admiration. And deep down, though he refused to admit it even to himself, Raymond Blake watched her go with something he hadn't felt in a very long time. A flicker, not of faith, not of hope, not yet, but perhaps the faintest whisper of healing. Days slipped into weeks, and what began as an unusual agreement slowly grew into a rhythm. Every evening, just as the sun dipped low and the mansion's golden lights flickered on, Naomi would appear at the great front doors. She never came empty-handed in spirit, though her hands always reached forward humbly to receive. The servants, who at first looked at her with suspicion or pity, began to soften. Now, they prepared trays for her before she even knocked. Trays not of scraps, but of untouched gourmet meals. Dinners too rich and extravagant to mean much to those who had them daily, but life itself to those who had nothing. Naomi carried them back to her neighborhood, her small arms wrapped tightly around the warm bundles. The path home was long and cracked, winding from marble gates into crumbling streets, from luxury into struggle. Yet every step she took carried a strange sense of purpose, and what she carried did more than fill empty stomachs. The food became fuel for something far greater. in Naomi's small neighborhood. People were used to hunger like others were used to weather. It came, it stayed, and they endured. Families stretched scraps. Children often slept without dinner. Mothers and fathers looked at empty cupboards with helplessness. But now, every evening, Naomi arrived like a messenger of hope. Her own mother and younger brother were the first to taste the blessing. Plates once bare now held roasted chicken, seasoned rice, fresh bread, vegetables that gleamed with butter. Her brother, no more than 6 years old, ate until his little belly was full, his eyes closing in peace instead of pain. But Naomi didn't stop there. She shared with her neighbors, the elderly woman next door, the struggling father whose paycheck never covered enough, the children who used to wander the streets hungry until night swallowed them. Night after night, the trays brought smiles. Tired faces softened into relief. Laughter began to echo again in a place once drowned in despair. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, the community began to change. Smiles replaced tears. Hope replaced hopelessness. And around dinner tables, small, cracked, worn tables, prayers of gratitude rose, not just for food, but for the unseen hand behind it. Every night, after delivering the meals, Naomi returned to the mansion. She didn't come back with empty hands. She came back with stories. One evening, she stood in the vast dining hall, her eyes shining with sincerity. "Mrs. Johnson said to tell you thank you," she said to Mr. Blake. "Her baby slept with a full stomach for the first time this week." Another night, her voice quivered with emotion. "Mr. Carter cried when I gave him dinner. He hadn't eaten in 2 days." Each story was a thread, weaving itself into the cracks of Mr. Blake's hardened heart. At first, he brushed them off. He would roll his eyes, wave his hand dismissively, and mutter something cold like, "They should thank you, not me." He told himself it was just charity, nothing meaningful. He told himself he was still the same man, untouched by sentiment. But the truth was different. Each story Naomi shared lingered in his mind long after she left. He thought of the crying father, the mother who could finally feed her child, the children whose laughter returned because of a simple plate of food. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the feeling building within him. For the first time in years, Raymond Blake felt useful, not as a tycoon building skyscrapers, not as a name printed on the covers of magazines, but as a man whose actions as small as letting go of food he never touched, had given life to others. It was a strange sensation, almost uncomfortable, but it was also alive, burning quietly in a corner of his heart that had long been cold. He began to wait for Naomi's visits. He noticed how the servants smiled when preparing her trays. He realized how quiet the mansion felt after she left. And little by little, the bitterness he had built around himself, brick by brick, began to erode. One evening, long after Naomi had gone, Raymond sat alone in his dining hall. The grand chandeliers glowed above him. The polished silverware gleamed, but none of it mattered. For the first time in a decade, he found himself whispering words he never thought he would say again. Maybe this is a miracle. The words caught him off guard. He wasn't even sure why he said them. But deep down, in the deepest part of his soul, he knew Naomi had been right all along. Miracles weren't always about walking again. Miracles weren't always thunder and lightning or instant transformations. Sometimes miracles came quietly, in the form of a little girl, in the form of a leftover meal, in the form of hope shared freely. And though he didn't admit aloud, Raymond Blake felt something stir inside him that hadn't stirred in years. A tiny seed of healing. Months slipped by, and what had begun as an awkward agreement between a bitter millionaire and a desperate little girl had blossomed into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. By now, Naomi's visits had become part of the mansion's rhythm. The servants no longer treated her as an intruder, but greeted her warmly, some even sneaking in extra desserts for her younger brother. And every evening, when she returned to her community with trays of food, the joy spread further and further, weaving a tapestry of hope that touched countless lives. But on this particular evening, Naomi arrived with something different. Not just her usual gratitude, not just another story of a hungry family fed, but with a gift. She stood in the grand dining hall, a little shy, clutching a rectangular object wrapped carefully in brown paper. Her big eyes flickered nervously toward Mr. Blake, who was seated in his usual spot at the head of the table. "Sir," she began softly, her voice carrying both excitement and hesitation, "the community, we wanted you to have this." She stepped forward and held out the package. With trembling fingers, Mr. Blake tore away the paper, revealing a framed collage. Inside the frame was a sea of faces, dozens of smiling children, mothers, fathers, elderly neighbors, even tiny babies being cradled in their parent arms. Each one held a small hand-painted sign. Together, they carried the same message. "Thank you, Mr. Blake." For a long moment, the old man couldn't breathe. His sharp eyes, so often filled with coldness, now blurred with tears he could no longer hold back. His hands that one signed deals worth millions without flinching, trembled as they clutched the frame. These weren't nameless faces. They were lives that had been touched, saved, lifted, all because of something as simple as leftovers he once dismissed as waste. Tears spilled down his cheeks. For the first time in a decade, Raymond Blake didn't feel like a prisoner in his wheelchair. He didn't feel like a man defined by his losses. He felt something he thought was gone forever. Purpose. He lifted his gaze toward Naomi, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You were right. This is a miracle, not for my legs, but from my heart." The little girl's smile was brighter than the chandeliers overhead, brighter than the gold that lined the mansion's walls. She stepped closer and said words that would stay with him forever. "See, sir, miracles don't always change your body. Sometimes they change your soul." Her innocence, her wisdom, her unshakable faith, it all came together in that one moment, and something inside Raymond shifted completely. From that day forward, things began to change. Raymond Blake was no longer the cold, bitter man who sneered at miracles. He became the man who made them happen. With Naomi's gentle encouragement and the picture of smiling faces always nearby, he launched a food program in her neighborhood. What began as trays of leftovers grew into a fully funded initiative. Daily meals, community kitchens, and resources that ensured no family went hungry again. The mansion, once silent and suffocating, now buzzed with purpose. Servants who had once carried trays mechanically now did so with pride, knowing where the food would end up. Mr. Blake, who once dreaded evenings, now awaited Naomi's visits eagerly, her laughter, her stories, her unwavering light. And though his legs never returned, though he remained in his chair, something far greater had been restored. His heart, his humanity, his faith in something bigger than himself. Because a miracle had walked into his mansion one quiet evening, not with riches, not with power, not with magic, but in the form of a poor, hungry girl who asked only for leftovers. A girl who turned scraps into blessings. A girl who transformed waste into hope. And that truly was a miracle. For the rest of his life, whenever Mr. Blake looked at the framed collage of smiling faces, he remembered the lesson Naomi had given him. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes a spark that lights up an entire community. Sometimes a miracle we're waiting for doesn't fix what's broken in our bodies, but heals what's been lost in our souls. And sometimes all it takes to begin that miracle is a single plate of leftovers.